Hello Primary 5. Miss Hiba Ahmed is with you. Today we will start the second term with Unit 1 and Lesson 1 Friction Force, and we will take today the Part 1 from this lesson. At first, what is the meaning of the friction force? Any two objects touching each other, so there is a friction force between them. So when this girl is swimming in the water, so her body and the water touching each other, so there is a force between the two surfaces, which is her body and the water, that's called friction force. And also this girl is sliding on the slide, so between her body and the slide there is a force which is meaning or which is called friction force. So the friction force is the force between two surfaces touching each other. Okay, and we must know that the friction force make any moving object stop moving. So without the friction force, if we start to move, we will not able to stop. But the friction force allow us to stop when we want to stop. Okay, so anything stop moving due to the friction force. So the friction force is the force between two surfaces touching each other, and it acts in the opposite direction of the movement. Okay, in this picture you can see this object. We want to move it in this direction. So between the surface of this object and between the ground, so there is a friction force. Why? Because we said that between any two surfaces touching each other there is a friction force. And we know that the friction force, it make any moving object stop moving. So it must be in the opposite direction of the movement, not in the same direction of the movement. If the friction force was in the same direction of the movement like this, it will not able to stop the movement. But if the friction force is in the opposite direction of the movement, the object is moving in this direction, the friction force must be in the opposite direction to allow to stop the moving from the object from moving. So what is the definition of the friction force? It's the force between two surfaces touching each other, and it acts in the opposite direction of the movement. It acts in the opposite direction of the movement. Okay? Okay. So here this boy is riding a bike. So his motion force or his moving force is in this direction. So the friction force will be in which direction, primary 5? In this direction? No, in the opposite direction. Okay, very good. Okay, here this boy is sliding on the ice. So his motion force or movement force will be in this direction. So the friction force will be in which direction? Very good, in the opposite direction of the movement. So don't forget, the friction force is the force between two surfaces touching each other, and it acts in the opposite direction of the movement. Okay, so we have here some notes we must to know. If I want to move something, okay, sometimes I can move this object and sometimes I cannot move the object. Okay, what happened? Here in this picture, I have here two surfaces touching each other. Okay, this car is touching the road. The tires of this car, they are touching the road. So between the tires and the road, there is a friction force. Okay, okay. When the motion force is bigger than the friction force, we will able to move the object. Okay, so here the motion force of this lady is bigger than the friction force in this direction, so this lady can move the car. Okay, okay. If I have a very big object, okay, like this one, that's the pushing force or the motion force or the movement force, and that's the direction of the friction force. Okay, and the friction force here is between the object and also the ground. Okay, okay. If the friction force is bigger than the moving force, we will not able to move the object. So if the friction force is smaller than the motion force, we will be able to move the object. But if the friction force is bigger than the motion force, we will not able to move the object. So the very heavy things, okay, you cannot move it. Why? Because the friction force is bigger than your movement force or your pushing force. But if you can move anything like this lady, so you must know that your movement force is bigger than the friction force. Okay? Okay. So when we're driving the car, what makes the car is moving in constant velocity or in constant speed. Okay, what make the speed of the car keep in 40, okay, and not increasing or decreasing if your daddy is driving the car in a speed of 40? How can he make the car keep in 40 speed? Okay, he can make the car keep in this speed without increasing or decreasing because the friction force is equal to the motion force. So when the friction force is equal to the movement force, so the body will move in constant velocity or constant speed. So we have here three notes. When the movement or pushing force is bigger than the friction force, so the object will move. When the friction force is bigger than the pushing force, so the object will not move. When the moving force, air resistance, it's one of the friction force and we will take it today. Okay? If the friction force is equal to the moving force, so they are equal to each other, so the body will move in constant velocity, and velocity meaning speed. So until now, don't forget, we take the definition of the friction force, which is the force between two surfaces touching each other. Very good. And it acts in the in the opposite direction of the movement. Okay, primary 5. When the moving force is bigger than the friction force, so the body will, very good, move. So here, when the friction force is bigger than the moving force, so the body will, very good, not move. If the friction force and the movement force are equal, so the body will move in, very good, constant velocity or constant speed. So we finished the definition of the friction. Now we will take the types of the friction force. We have three types: friction force between solids, friction force between solids and air, friction force between solids and water. So between solids and air, between solids and water. Let's start with the friction force between solids, like the friction force between car tires and the road, like the friction force between our shoes and the road, like all the friction force between the internal parts of the machine. Any machine consisted of parts inside it. When these parts are moving, so there is a friction force between these parts. This friction force is the friction force between solids. Okay? Okay. Like here, Berto, all of these examples are examples for friction force between solids. Between the tires of the road, tires of the bicycle and the road, between the tires of the car and the road also, between the slide and the ice, and between the body of the girl and the slide. All of them are solids. This tire of the car and the road, they are solid. So friction force between these two surfaces is the friction force between solids. And all of these examples the same. So we finished the friction force between solids. Now we will take number 2 from the types of the friction force, with the friction force between solids and the air, like the friction force between the body of the bird and the air. The body of the bird is which type of material? Solid. And the air is which type of material? Gas. Okay, so the friction force here is between solid and air. Okay, the friction force between solid and air, we can call it another name, which is air resistance, air resistance, air resistance. So what is the meaning of the air resistance? It's the friction force due to the movement of solid objects through the air. One more time. This bird is solid and she is moving through the air. So the body of the bird is touching the air. So there is two surfaces touching each other. The solid body of the bird and the air. So this type of the friction force, we called it air resistance. So what is the air resistance? It's a friction force due to the movement of solid objects through the air. And also here's the plane. Okay, the plane is a solid object, and when the plane is flying in the sky, so the body of the plane, which is solid, is touching the air. So there is a friction force which is called air resistance due to the movement of solid through the air, and also the parachute. Okay, so we finished the friction force between solid and air resistance. Now we will take the water resistance. If the body is moving inside the water, like this fish its body is solid and it's moving through the water. So the body of the fish is touching the water. So there is friction force between two surfaces, which is solid and water. So this type of the friction force, we call it what? Water resistance. Water resistance. And also this girl is swimming in the water. So the solid body of the girl is touching the water. So we have here two surfaces touching each other. So this type of the friction force is called water resistance. So the water resistance is the friction force due to the movement of solid objects through the water. And as you can see, the definition of the water resistance and the definition of the air resistance, they are the same. But at the end, if it's a water resistant, we said that the object moves through the water, and if air resistant, we said that the object moves through the air. So, what is the air resistance? One more time, it's the friction force due to the movement of solid objects through the water, like swimming of the fish in the water, like the swimming of this girl in the water, and also like the movement of the ship inside the water. Ship is a solid and touching the water. So between them there is a friction force. Which type of the friction force? Very good. Water resistance. So don't forget primary 5. We take today the types of the friction force between solids and air, which is called what? Very good. Air resistance between solids and water, which is called what? Very good. Water resistance. So we take today three definitions. Friction force, which is the force between two surfaces touching each other and it acts in the opposite direction. And we take also the air resistance, which is the friction force due to the movement of solids through the air. And we also take water resistance with the friction force due to the movement of solid objects through the water. And don't forget that we have three types of the friction force, which is solid, the friction between solids, friction between solids and air, which is called air resistance, and friction between solids and water, which is called water resistance. Thank you for listening. Primary 5, Miss Hima Ahmed was with you.